let's see. So last week we had created a project, and we had named it CS4500 SP19 S2-JGA. And let's see what we built. We had created a in the models we had created a user and a hello object. We had created also a controller that allowed us to make available a couple of strings, right? What else did we do? We created the beginnings of a user model that had username, password, and whatnot. And what else did we do? That's the demo. I think that's all we did. Yes. Let's see where we are in our Git repository. So let's go to section 2. And if we go to CS, we can say git status. Okay, so it looks like we're on master branch and everything's up to date. Excellent. So what I wanted to discuss is the skill that, one of the skills that I'd like to present today. Web services. So web services is a mechanism that allows us to share, right, data and behavior on the network, right? So that you can make available anywhere across the network any piece of data, right, or any piece of behavior, right? So you can map it to either an IP address or some URL that specifically maps anywhere in the world in a global wide area network. Okay? So that you can map some function that you can execute, mapping it to a URL. And then that function can run some algorithm, calculate something, and then come back with some data. Maybe to do some data transformation. It can kick off a process. It can access some database. It can do whatever you want, right? So all mapped to some URL on a wide area network. Yes. So web services is the capability of being able to create this, right? So last week we had created a Spring Boot application that allowed us to just do that. Okay, we created a Hello World service that allows us to expose just a simple Hello World. Okay, so for instance, underneath the web services most commonly they use HTTP as a protocol to communicate between in a network, right? And the HTTP protocol provides many different methods that you can generate between a request and a response. The most common one is HTTP GET, right? That's what browsers do most of the times, right? What browsers do is whenever you access a particular website, right, it generates a GET request to that particular server, right? And the server responds with some data. Yes? Now, here the content is HTML, but it doesn't have to be. Right? The content can be anything. It could be actual data. It could be XML. Right? It could be JSON data. Right? It doesn't have to be consumable by a human being. It could be consumable by processes. Processes could be exchanging data back and forth. Yes? We used to use all sorts of mechanisms to do this back then, before HTTP and the web. But now it has become very, very easy to do it using just plain old HTTP and web servers. Okay, so in particular, GET request allows us to just map to a particular URL and execute some function. And last week we just had executed some really simple hello world. So let's expand on that a little bit. Let's expand on that. Last week we had created a controller and a simple hello object right here. Right? But here we had created a simple user, but we never exposed this data of a user to any network access. Right? So say you want to, for instance, one of the assignments, you'll be asked later to implement some user management, right? Being able to create users, log in, register, delete users, update their profile, things like that. Yes. So for instance, one of the things that you might be asked to do is to list all the current users in a system. right, in some database. So let's do that. Let's play around with that. Right, so here's a data model, right, that represents user information, right, username, password, first name, and last name. How would I expose this data on the network? So what you're asked to do in the assignment is to create a service, because that's what web services do. They allow you to access data and behaviors on a network. So let's do that. Here on the controller, we're going to create a service. We're going to create a user controller. Oftentimes, instead of using the controller is an implementation detail. A more generic idea of what a controller is doing is that it's providing a service. So I'm going to call it user service. Right? It's a more generic, more high-level understanding of what this is doing. Right? Controller is a low-level HTTP endpoint, right? That you can hit it and you can execute. But a service is something more, more generic. Okay, so user service. So this user service means that it's providing any operation that you want to do about users would be available through here. What could you possibly do about users? Well, one of the things I would like to be able to do probably is return the list of all the users. You know, so find all users, for instance, right? Okay. Or I'd like to be able to do maybe find me a particular user. Find me a user by their username, for instance. You know, if you give me their username, I can return to you a particular user whose username is that. Or I might be able to say, maybe I want to create a brand new user, create user. And you give me, as long as you give me a user, I'll create the user, right? Or maybe I want to remove the user and delete user. Maybe if you give me their ID, I'll remove them by ID. And all sorts of CRUD operations, create, update, delete. Create, read, update, and delete, right? All the CRUD operations that we might do about any particular piece of data. Yes? All right, so the find all users probably, let's create a couple of users here. So user Alice, new user. What do we have here for users? We probably want also an integer ID, and probably want, let's create an ID here as well. I'm going to add the setter and getter for ID down here. Very good. And let's create a couple of constructors here. Let's create a public constructor. This is the no argument constructor. That's the default constructor. And I'll create maybe a user that can take some of the other constructors. Source. Let's generate a couple other constructors. One that takes all the fields. There we go. So here's one that takes all the fields. So here from the user service, I can create a couple of users. I'll create one that takes ID, username, password, first name, and last name. So let's create a couple here. So 1, 2, 3, Alice, and Wonderland. So there we go. So we have one Alice, and let's create one with Bob with a different ID. And this is Bob, and this is Bob Marley. All right, and we want to maybe add them to an array list. So list of users, new array list of users. Actually, let's just make it an array of users. That'll be easier. So this would be a user as an array, and this might be Alice and Bob. And we're going to return users. Okay? I'm going to comment for a second. So we have here a user service that would return maybe all the users, right? And we want to expose it. To expose it, we can use the REST controller technique we learned last week. Right, this is going to allow us to put this class available on an HTTP request, And we can map it against a get mapping and say that I'm going to map this to API and user. And that's going to return to me all the users. So if the URL ends with /API/users, it'll return all the users. Yes, let's try it out, see if this blows up. Do I have something running already? Let me run it. Oh, I don't know which one is this. It's this one, right? Let's run it. Run as Java application. Let's see if this blows up. Maybe. Let's see, localhost 8080, and it's we mapped it to what? /API/user. There we go. So there's Alice and there's Bob. Okay. So this technique of being able to expose data, right, to a network access is very important, right? It's called web services, being able to access data and behaviors through the access of HTTP. Notice that this is not meant to be displayed, it's not meant to be a web page or anything like that. It's just data transfer amongst two particular processes. One of the processes is the server, and the other process is the browser, but it doesn't have to be. It could be amongst any two endpoints that know how to talk the HTTP protocol. Make sense? All right. In this particular case, what we're going to be doing is obviously adding more skills to this and using JavaScript or React to be able to read this and display maybe as a list of users, right? That a system administrator can then, delete a user or update a user or create a brand new user, all going through this one particular user service. Yes, this user service. Okay, and so we'll be adding more to this as we go. If you could go over this this presentation of web services, right? It presents what a web service is and what are some of the constraints and what you can do and not do. All right, excellent. Thank you.